should only relying on Ethereum for bridge security, should that always be our end goal?
When you think about being able to move assets across chain, like we don't have any insurance that like, oh, if this platform fails, do I get my money back? No.
Is bridging even real to begin with? My opinion is that it's only real if you're actually burning the assets on the source chain.
From Alysia Tech and Ellie Davidson, welcome to Composable, a podcast that takes you deep into the tech behind Web3's building blocks.
Every episode, we dive into one key question about how crypto works today and the design space for how it might look in the future.
Composable is an espresso pod, a production of Espresso Systems. All opinions expressed by Composable's hosts and podcast guests are solely their own views. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as investment, legal, or technical advice.
And we're live. Ellie, how are you doing today?
I'm really good, and I'm excited for today's topic, which is bridging even real? And we'll discuss what we mean by that. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. I had 2 cups of coffee today, which is not normal for me. So let's see. So
All
is
right. Okay.
bridging even real? Why are we even questioning the reality of bridging?
Yeah. So if you think about it, what is happening when you bridge? And like a regular bridge, a physical bridge, you're actually moving something from one destination to another. But in a lot of bridges today, you're not actually moving anything. You're just locking it on one side and then unlocking something on the other side that is supposed to be equivalent, but maybe it's not. And so, yeah, this is how we can discuss like, are bridges even real since they're not actually moving any asset from one chain to another? Although sometimes they are. And we can talk about that too.
Yeah, that's a good point about the fact that is it even the same as on the other chain? Because technically, if you're talking about ERC20 tokens, they're fungible. So surely, if you're someone like, yeah, I know Web3, these are fungible tokens. If I bridge it from Solana to Ethereum, it should be the same thing. But because of the way bridging works, it probably might not be. And like you mentioned, it's not necessarily a transfer. You could be locking up assets. So therefore, what you're actually doing is trusting either the smart contract or whatever infrastructure that exists to give you the asset that you intend to get.
Mhm.
So, is bridging real? I mean, I think the fact that users know what bridging is means it's real. Like the fact that we know about it is real, but does it do what they expect it to do? I think that's what we're trying to unpack here. At least I
Yeah,
hope to
exactly.
unpack. And I think when we think about bridging, there are various things to consider. So the asset being locked on the source chain, normally that is the original asset. So let's say you were to have USDT on Ethereum and you want to bridge it to another chain, then you have the original asset on the source chain. And then you have the asset that's actually issued on the destination chain. That's another aspect of the bridging cycle. Like, is it the same USDT that you had on Ethereum? And then there's also the bridging infrastructure that you decided to use, because what if in flight during the bridge something went wrong? Even if it was a bridge that was bridging native assets, which we will explain soon, what if the bridge infrastructure actually fails? Then you don't receive the native asset, even though that is the best asset to receive. And then people might say, well, it doesn't matter because I really need to get my assets across this other chain because I would love to use this new application with high yields, or I would love to buy this NFT. So I'm curious to everyone watching, like what they think is the real definition of bridging, what aspects of bridging they care about the most when they determine which bridge they should use. Because in the last episode, we saw this website called too many bridges dot WTF, and we still had no idea what to use, even though we had lots of options. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll ask this question again towards the end and see if people maybe have changed their mind. Right now, I think I would go with C personally. What about you?
Interesting. I think I will go with B. It says
Um,
realize the asset on a destination chain. Oh,
yeah.
by the way, if you are listening to this podcast, we are doing this live right now. So we have a Twitter stream. So if you'd like to see what we're talking about, a lot of the times they're going to be diagrams. Definitely follow us on Twitter at Composable Pod, where you can see the live streams, sometimes even before it drops on the podcast platform. But yeah, so you said C, which is trust in the bridge and its infrastructure. Why did you choose C?
Yeah. So I guess I feel like this means you need to trust in the bridge. And then you also, depending on the kind of bridge, you're trusting in the destination chain as well.
Yeah.
But the reason I said this is that, the assets are only good if you can claim them one to one back to their original assets. And so if a bridge somehow messes this up and they mint tokens that don't exist, you no longer can claim them one to one. And same thing for if a destination chain did this. So that's why I say that it's only as real as the infrastructure underneath it and how much you trust that infrastructure.
Okay. That is fair. I would agree with that. But I have a slight preference for B, which is the assets issued on the destination chain, just because I'm thinking about the perspective of the user, understanding the intricacies of bridge infrastructure and which one is better than the other is kind of hard right now. So if someone wanted to ask me, like, oh, should I use this bridge that's giving me wrapped ETH or wrapped insert the token here? Or should I use this bridge that's giving me the native asset? I would lean towards that one if possible. Of course, you still should still check to see if the bridge is even real, if it's like trustworthy, if it's been audited and all these kind of things. But I think as much as you can have the native asset on the destination chain, I love that. And I think it also helps with composability too. But we will get into it.
Yeah, and I think so it is really hard to tell the difference between a lot of these bridges, but so I believe L2Beat has actually they have a bridge page and they've started expanding it out a lot more. So hopefully that'll make it easier for people to kind of understand the different trust assumptions between all of these bridges.
Yeah, I really appreciate L2B's effort in this space for helping us understand the risk from the user perspective. And one thing I saw on Twitter today, Ellie, as I was scrolling, I saw that there is something called USDT Zero that apparently has got launched onto Arbitrum. And I was so confused. I'm like, what is USDT Zero? But it seems like it is a legit thing that is from USDT. And apparently is how they're helping other chains get access to the USDT token. Do you know anything about this? Have you heard of this before?
So no, today was the first I had heard of this, and I admittedly haven't gotten a chance to super look into it, but there's a lot of things I'd like to discuss about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, one thing I think is really interesting is that it sounds like they're upgrading existing USDT to this new UST zero. And that's really interesting because it means that the USDT zero is the native asset. So when I first saw this, I was like, okay, USDT zero is just going to be another asset that should be backed one to one by real tether. But if something catastrophic happened, you would still have your real tether behind it. But no, it seems like this is actually a native token and they actually are doing real native bridging, which is, I think, really great because this is the future that we want to get to. Um, but they also are not necessarily using native bridges to do this, which I also think is very interesting. And maybe we can have a discussion of what is bridge security. This is a really big rabbit hole we could go down to, but typically when we talk about bridge security, we want it to be completely trustless, which isn't really trustless, but it means that you only have to trust Ethereum and the proof system or whatever the bridge uses to prove things. And so this is what we kind of call like maximum security, but a lot of bridges don't use that. For example, layer 0, a very very secure bridge, but it uses committees or these distributed validator networks. And I think it's really interesting because should only relying on Ethereum for bridge security, should that always be our end goal? And like clearly Tether thought, hey, using layer 0, which again is a very trustworthy protocol, is okay to back their native token.
They've launched an Arbitrum, which means that you can bridge it in between other chains that support it. And it's using Layer Zero's omni-chain fungible token transfer protocol, which you definitely need to go on their website to learn more about it. But essentially, Layer Zero is a very popular cross messaging protocol, and it's being used by a lot of bridges. And because USDT is a stablecoin issuer, and because stablecoins are one of the most used applications right now, like it's very important for them to be cross chain. Everyone is trying to make sure their application is cross chain, and a stablecoin is an application as well. So you'd see the same thing with Circle as well. And USDT is also making their foray into the space. But I definitely agree with Ellie that I am very surprised that they didn't make a canonical bridge option, but it could be for many many things, like potentially maybe the developer support that they would get from layer zero maybe was quite high, and that was encouraging for them. It's also used a lot. So, they also have that to gauge from.
I think it's also interesting. I'm wondering if they made this choice because they're across multiple L1s, right? So if your tether is existing across Solana and Ethereum, well, then it really doesn't make sense to only trust Ethereum for your security. So maybe in this way, they can, by using layer zero, they can kind of like customize their trust. So they're not actually only relying on the security of one chain, and they're relying on the security of both chains, for example.
Essentially, everyone knows there's USDT on Ethereum. So let's say you wanted to bridge this USDT zero onto Arbitrum. The original asset is locked on Ethereum on that contract, and then it is minted on Arbitrum. Once it's minted on Arbitrum, it's now in the form USDT zero, and this is where they're using, as far as I understand, the layer zero omni-chain fungible token protocol, which makes it so that they can have cross-chain messaging of this token across many chains. And when they're actually doing it in the USDT zero, they're not using a lock and unlock. Instead, they're using a mint and burn, which is a bit different to how they're doing it on Ethereum. And then finally, when you want to redeem the original asset, you can bridge it back to Ethereum and you get a one-to-one bridge. So I saw this and I thought, okay, I really need to try learning how to bridge with layer zero. This weekend, I actually spent some time going through the developer docs, understanding like how to create bridge contracts. It worked. I was able to send a message across chain, which was nice, but it was a lot slower than I thought. And I think that's because of block confirmations. And it has not been that slow. When Ellie and I did bridging last week. Last week, we tried out a bunch of bridging platforms, some of them which were based on layer zero, and the transaction times were actually quite fast. So I would love to learn more about the security models that developers are choosing when they're using layer zero. So like Ali was saying, like, oh, it's interesting that USDT decided to use layer zero and not canonical bridge contracts. But potentially the security model that they created was something that they deemed to be quite secure. Maybe they have a high number of block confirmations. One thing I also read is that they are using both a layer zero validator committee, and then they also have their own validator committee. And you have to have verifications from both before the cross-chain transfer can complete. So potentially the configuration is in such a way where they do have high security and they feel comfortable with that. But yeah, I would love to learn more about it. The docs were helpful, but it definitely didn't explain that much level of detail yet.
Here's a tweet from Arbitrum where they talk about how so Securitize is this platform to make real world assets into tokens. And you can now bridge those tokens on Wormhole. And, Arbitrum is one of the chains that you can bridge them on. I think that this is quite interesting in the bridging use case because it it like questions where does the actual asset live. So in the case of say Ethereum, the native asset lives on Ethereum, nowhere else. But in the case of real world tokenization, the native or the real asset lives presumably in some like physical bank or something like that. Like there's some note that is where it lives. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of think through what would happen if you did have some sort of a bridge hack with these tokens. Like, let's say I have a token that represents, the S&P 500, and this token gets doubled through some bridge hack. Like, what does this actually mean? Considering that it is connected to very real world values. I'm kind of curious. I looked through Securitize's website to see if they gave more details on how they're thinking about this trust model because it's kind of just like any derivative. The derivative is supposed to be representative of the thing, but it's not exactly representative of it. But I wasn't able to really find anything, like what happens if some L2 gets hacked and there's users that think that they own this real world asset, but they don't.
Yeah, like why is this not more readily available? This should be like the number one thing or number two thing when you see on these websites. Like, what is a security model? And I think it is overwhelming when you think about it, like how exactly it works. But at the same time, your users are not just end users. You also have developers who have to make choices based on your security model. And in terms of securitize, I feel like you can also view them as a bridge. They're bridging real world assets on chain. And then you have bridges that bridge digital assets from one chain to another. So I think it's exciting for Wormhole to have this partnership and also for Arbitrum to be able to benefit from it. But it's a nice signaling that interoperability matters in different directions. And thinking about the cross-chain interoperability is a conversation that we have been having for a while now, but definitely is becoming more important, especially when it comes to security models. In the past, we did have really massive bridge hacks. I personally have not been following the bridge hack news, so I don't know what the current state of things are, but I know for sure the security model matters a lot.
Yeah, for sure, it does. And I mean, I like to kind of see how this compares to traditional finance. And if you look at like the New York Stock Exchange, for example, I don't know, like what would happen if the New York Stock Exchange decided to just like double the amount of stocks that it was selling? Um, presumably there would be some sort of big fuss about it and we'd all roll back. But I guess do you do that in Ethereum? The whole point of Ethereum is like, yeah, you have social consensus, but you're not supposed to use it to roll back things like this. So I guess there's pros of using blockchain to back this because it's very decentralized, it's censorship resistant. But then the negatives are that there's a really small chance that something catastrophic could happen where now your token does not match the real asset underneath.
Yeah. I think one thing the real world benefits from is the fact that it's very regulated. So I don't think it'll be easy for someone to inflate. And even if there is inflation, which can happen, for example, the central bank can inflate the dollar, it still is something that's a process that are a lot of humans are involved. And there may be bad actors, but it's not very clear who the bad actors are, which is also the benefit of blockchain technology. You can actually see what went wrong with the transaction. And I really like the fact that you brought in the real world example, because even bridging, I like to say bridging is like moving from one bank to another. If you want to send pounds to a bank in the US, that is a transaction that's happening where your bank is now saying, okay, you're less £100, and you expect this other bank account somewhere in the US to now say you have, let's say, $90 US, whatever the conversion rate is. And essentially that happens in your bank's ledger. So that's like a data entry in their database, because most likely you're transacting online. And then on the receiving bank, they're also now adding this credit. And then there's some kind of balancing that happens. I don't think they're actually moving physical to cash. Maybe they just have like a reserve that they just change the numbers of. Potentially there is physical assets moving. Whereas in Web3, it's a bit different. In Web3, I actually have a nice diagram which I will show here. So in Web3, you have the asset which is in one location. You send it somewhere. So for example, if you send it to a bridge contract, it gets locked into this bridge contract. And then the asset is now represented on another chain. So it's almost like a teleportation, or like it's spawning. But the difference is the original asset, you no longer have access to it. But it depends on what representation it is on the destination chain, which depends on how native, you can view this asset, because an asset can be wrapped, it can be considered bridge, or it can be considered the native asset. And not every asset you bridge is immediately a native asset. And I think that's one aspect of the bridging experience that is a bit confusing to users. Like, if you bridged USDC and now you have this new USDC in your wallet and you're looking for just USDC, don't know where to find it, you realize some protocols don't support it. So then when you reach on the destination chain, you have to swap the USDC you received into the real USDC, and then you realize, oh, wait, is there enough liquidity for the swap? So you no longer get a one-to-one swap when you have to convert it. So there are definitely some disadvantages of not receiving the original token. But having wrapped assets has facilitated a lot of these cross-chain experiences. So it's not necessarily completely bad, but definitely reduces the user experience.
Yeah, and when I think about it, I actually think that bridging in Web3 is actually really, really similar to traditional finance. Um, I used to work at a traditional finance company, so I find this very interesting. But there's this kind of concept in traditional finance of uncompensated risk, which is risk that you don't get rewarded for taking. So this would be something like you don't get more interest for taking this risk. And I think that bridging is an example of this kind of uncompensated risk where if a bridge hack happens, you're not getting any compensation for that by getting any sort of extra money when the bridge works successfully. And I think
Yeah.
that it's really difficult to calculate uncompensated risk, let alone kind of keep it in your mind all of the time because it can be this really vague thing. And Anyway, yeah, but traditional finance has the exact same thing. For example, if I do a bank transfer and then before that bank transfer completes, one of the banks defaults, then I'm out of money. And that's uncompensated risk. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I would really love to hear like traditional finance people's side of this on how they view uncompensated risk in these bridges.
Interesting. I mean, I wish I could comment, but I have no idea how that relates to Web3. But one thing I do
Mhm,
think about is insurance. Like, when you think about being able to move assets across chain, like we don't have any insurance that like, oh, if this platform fails, do I get my money back? No. So I suppose there's no compensation for the risk that you take, which is why it's super important to understand the risk, but
mhm,
people still do it anyway. So I don't know what the solution is here.
mhm,
But one thing I want to mention is when we think about assets and what happens to the asset as it moves across the chain, I just want to highlight that like the asset is no longer yours. And we know this because whenever you have to bridge an asset to another chain, you normally have to do this transaction called an approval, where you approve this contract to spend this asset. And this approval transaction is essentially giving the smart contract the ability to do what it wants with this asset in order to then give you the representation of this asset on the destination chain. So, for example, one model for bridging is a lock and mint, which is what we saw with the USDT to USDT zero. The asset is locked on Ethereum in a smart contract, but now you have this representation on the destination chain called USDT zero. Another example is a burn and mint. Similar, it can be burned on a contract, the source chain, and then minted on a destination chain. And then there's also, if you're using a liquidity pool, then the asset is not necessarily locked or burned, but the asset is more so transferred to the liquidity pool so that they can then fill the transaction for you on the destination chain. But my favorite is a native bridge. This is where the asset on the source chain, in some cases burned, in some cases locked. But on the source chain, it's locked. But on the destination chain, you also receive what we call the native asset or the canonical asset. And in the case of USDT zero, I don't know if you saw in the documentation if they said it was native, but even the fact that it's called USDT zero, I have a hard time wrapping my mind about whether it is native or if it is wrapped. Because if it is native,
yeah.
why did they not just call it the same thing?
Yeah, no, I kind of agree. So, when I'm thinking, can you really say it's a native asset unless you burn it on the source chain? Because
Mhm.
if you just lock it on the source chain, it still exists on the source chain, and this means that, it could happen that on the destination chain on this L2, something happens, but the source of truth is this locked fund on the source chain. So it doesn't matter what the L2 does. But if you
Yeah.
really burned those tokens on the L1, then they would be truly native. So I think to be a truly native bridge, you need to actually burn the tokens on the source chain. What do you think? Do you
Yeah,
agree?
I agree with you. I agree with you. That makes so much sense because if the idea is this asset is now no longer in this destination, now you're here, you teleported. Like I
Mhm.
shouldn't exist in two places if I'm the real me.
Yeah, exactly.
So
So
yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So maybe like to our question at the beginning, is bridging even real? I I would say that it's only real if you're burning the asset on the source chain. That's the only way it's real. Otherwise, it's not like quite real. And I
Yeah.
think going back to Tether, I agree with you. I think that they are going for like a native asset bridge, but the fact that they do call it something different than native Tether kind of
Yeah.
implies like, well, maybe it's not quite native. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I even wonder what went into that decision. I don't know too much about the process, but if you want to use USDC on a new chain, so let's say we just fill up Ali and Ellie chain right now, we can't just convince USDC or Circle, the company, to launch their native asset on the chain because we have to prove to them that, our chain has the activity. So what developers do is they create something called bridged USDC, which is contracts that are identified as bridge USDC contracts. So when users bridge from, let's say, Ethereum to our new chain, they get bridge USDC. And then finally, when you prove your activity, then you can go to Circle and be like, hey, Wagwan, like, look at my chain. We're doing really well. I think you should, bridge. You
Mhm.
should put your native asset, sorry. And then that's when they then decide to now launch the native asset. So I wonder if USDT Zero is aiming for a similar thing where they have this very well recognized bridged USDT, but then after time, when you prove yourself, then they would launch the native version. So it could be that, but not too sure.
I was gonna say, this also reminds me of, like, Arbitrum. So there's, Circle USDC, but then there's, like, Circle USDC that's actually minted directly on Arbitrum and not on the L1, and I think yeah, like, I'm wondering if this, USDT 0 is kind of something similar because you could argue, like, so long as you trust Circle and you're
Mhm.
trusting Arbitrum and Ethereum, that USDC should always be redeemable one to one to real US dollars.
Yeah.
But, you know, I guess in theory, something crazy could happen where the USDC on Arbitrum is not worth the same value as the USDC on Ethereum because they're like kind of two. They're like they have different issuers. Yeah.
I agree. And from the perspective that, okay, if you have USDC on Arbitrum, that even if Circle deployed it, and even though Circle is a company which is deemed centralized, the fact that you're using USDC means you trust them. So we leave that as foundation. But then Arbitrum, its validator set is completely different from the Ethereum validator set. So I sometimes think about this, like I have a lot of assets on a chain that's not Ethereum because the gas fees are low. But I'm like, am I making a bad decision here? Because if this chain goes down, even if this is a native asset, if this chain for some reason is compromised, it's gone. The real asset, the wrapped asset. So yeah, you have to think about the environment you're in.
That's actually a really good point. I was saying how bridging isn't real unless you burn the asset, but one benefit to not burning the asset is that if the destination chain like goes crazy, a user can always get their funds back on the source chain, and maybe that actually is a really good thing. S
Interesting.
yeah.
But you know what? I've never actually heard someone give a positive reason for having a wrapped asset. So like, a mint and a lock and mint. And I think that's one.
Mhm.
But it sounds almost as though that is something that would have to be like if they have a lot of control on the asset, because some assets you can pause it, you can do all sorts of stuff, like whoever issued the contract. So in order for them to recognize that, hey, this new chain that was created actually was a big scam, and we feel so horrible because there was so much value locked, we are going to make a decision as the holders of the multi-sig to then allow persons to redeem their tokens. And that's like
Mhm.
a very social decision. It would not happen automatically. But yes,
Yeah.
good. Interesting. I love this idea that it has to be burned to be considered native, because I even think about when there was this painter or artist, forgive me for my ignorance, but it was being tokenized as an NFT and it was in Sotheby's, and I think they burned it or something like
Mm,
that. They
yeah.
burned the art and people were like, "Oh, what are you doing? How could you burn real art?" But I think it was very symbolic of like this now exists purely on chain and the real asset is the one on chain. Because back in the
Mhm.
day, there was a lot of conversation about are NFTs even real? If I have the Mona Lisa and it's an NFT, does it
Yeah.
matter? Because I can just copy paste the JPEG.
Yeah. And I mean, I sometimes I feel like we don't maybe really give enough credit to how similar bridging it really is to traditional finance. Now that I've been thinking about this, I'm so onto this idea that it's so like traditional finance because it really is. In traditional finance, you don't always have the exact asset. For example, your bank doesn't actually hold your money, right? They lend it out to people and that's how they make money. Theoretically, you maybe couldn't withdraw all of your funds from a bank. It's just like the same thing, but I think you also don't care about that when you go to a bank. Like, I never go to a bank and I'm like, maybe I won't be able to withdraw my money? Like, I just assume, yeah, it's fine.
Girl, I feel like I have stories about this that you would always ring in my mind where I'm so worried. I'm like, what if one day I go to the bank and they're like, you cannot withdraw your money? And I remember this
Yeah.
happened in Greece like a few years ago. Don't remember when, don't remember why, something to do with the EU. And they were limiting people to, I think, 200 euros a day. Please fact check me. But I was like, that is wild because people were trying to fly out of Greece and they couldn't because they didn't have enough cash to be able to leave because the banks were like, we're not going to allow you to do a bank run. Like,
Mhm.
these are our funds. And I think it's similar to like if you lock your assets up into a contract and you realize you want to just redeem it all, it's similar with a bank. Like from the time you decide to put your cash into digital money, so it's stored in a bank, you are now under the bank's rules. And they do make their rules public. Like, you probably have a withdrawal limit of X per month or X per day. But they probably do have situations where they have more control and it's not very clear. Like, I don't think people knew that the bank could do that, but at least with a smart
Yeah.
contract, you can see the rules of the contract and see that, okay, the contract can't do that if they want to. And I think that's one cool thing about bridging in Web3.
Mhm.
So when we think about bridging in Web3, we talk a lot about moving from chains, and we know that there are lots of applications that allow us to do this. But then there are different types of chains, or should I say different layers? There is layer one, there's layer two, there's layer three. Thank God there's not layer four, but it might be coming soon.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. I'm sure there exists someone who's making a layer 4.
I don't know what the layer four does, but it's probably like an AI agent chain. But anyway, you heard it here first. But apparently, and I have experienced this myself, the bridging experience is not the same. If I'm bridging from L1 to L2, it's usually faster than L2 to L1. And I'm speaking specifically about optimistic layer twos. So, do you want to share some insights about why this might be?
Yeah. So this mostly affects optimistic rollups, but it can actually also affect ZK rollups as well, but for a different reason. But so when you're bridging from the L1 to L2, the L2 settles to the L1. So they're already trusting the L1 for its state. So therefore, you can say, okay, I bridge my funds to this L2 so long as this L1 block does become canonical. And if that L1 block doesn't become canonical, then like all of the rollups state is thrown out. And this is why rollups usually wait a long time to make sure that there's no reorging on Ethereum. Whereas when you are withdrawing back to Ethereum, the L1 does not trust the L2. So you kind of have to have this period where um, you have to prove that this happened, and the L1 is not going to reorg if the L2 did something wrong. So it's more difficult to bridge back to the L1. Um, a lot of this specifically in optimistic rollups is because you have to have a fraud proof window. And generally, that has to be usually it's chosen to be pretty long because you want to make sure people have time to submit these fraud proofs. But this also applies for like a ZK rollup as well, because you only can bridge back to the L1 depending on how often you settle back to the L1. So even if a ZK rollup takes, they only post every 4 hours because of the cost of ZK proofs, that still means a user would have to wait 4 hours before they could withdraw their funds. So, and I think a lot of it also just comes down to that the L1 is more expensive. So, it's really easy to populate a message on the L2 and bridge funds over. It's a lot more expensive to do it the other way around.
Okay. So with the layer twos, the way that a layer two knows that its state will not change is by some sort of proof. So it is using the L1 as a security layer and is constantly sending the last batch of transactions to the security layer, like, hey, this is what just happened. And the layer one chain is just accepting transactions from a whole bunch of chains. So it doesn't have any concept about what's happening in L2. And then with the L2s, like the optimistic rollups, the way that they operate their system, they may have validators that are checking that the transactions are valid, but they don't constantly prove this when it gets posted to the L1. It just sends like, yeah, these were the last valid batch of transactions. But they do have this optimistic way of, or I wouldn't say optimistic, I'll say delayed. So they have this delayed proof which happens, which gives
Mhm.
validators an opportunity to say, that doesn't look quite right. So optimistically, we think everything is right, but we give you 7 days to dispute it if there is some issue. So as a result, like if you are an application that's bridging from layer two to layer one, then, you have to wait until you have this fraud proof window that has closed. But I have noticed that not every application does this. Not every bridge I interact with when I go from layer two to layer one takes that time. So what is a sorcery they're doing?
Yeah. So the sorcery they're doing is that it takes this time to go through the native bridge, and they're not using the native bridge. And this
Mm,
means that they're just holding liquidity on both chains. So essentially, what they're doing is saying, okay, I see you deposited a transaction to bridge back to the L1. I think that that L1 state is eventually going to become finalized on Ethereum in 7 days. So I'll just front you the money now. And then in 7 days, I get your money back and I'm made whole. And presumably they charge some sort of a fee to, so they can make money doing this. And so this works really well. This is kind of like a big part, like the whole reason behind like intent based bridges and things like that. The only downside is that it requires liquidity on both chains.
Mhm.
And most bridges work this way. They require you to have liquidity on both chains. And this is where things like synchronous composability get really interesting because you no longer actually have to have liquidity on both chains. And that means you can bridge any amount you want. The fee that you're paying for bridging doesn't have to be related to the amount of money that you're bridging, and things become really cool. And an even cooler thing is you can actually take a lot of the use cases today where you have to bridge to another chain, and you can actually just remove the need to bridge at all. And so all of this you can get with synchronous composability. We can probably go into synchronous composability in another episode, but um, yeah, I think it's really interesting to kind of see how bridging can evolve in the future and how it can change. And really, like, I think if we have synchronous composability for users, bridging will be a very different experience. And I think that people will use bridges for, well, the same reasons, but I think it'll be different, I guess is what I think. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree that synchronous composability will be a better experience because you know for sure the transaction succeeded immediately. You don't have to worry about some sort of failure scenario on the destination chain because you know that if there was, the entire transaction will fail and it will not be like a partial state or the state would be consistent. And in terms of bridging from layer two to layer one, I think a lot about finality. And I think a lot about how circa a year ago, I was not thinking about finality at all. And I would
Mhm.
consider myself as someone who's builds in Web3, a Web3 developer, but it wasn't something that I was thinking about. Like I never once pondered, like, I wonder how many block confirmations have passed before I think about if
Yeah.
a transaction is valid. And when I go through the documentation of these platforms now, I judge them based on whether they had a page talking about block confirmations. And if you don't have this page, I'm like, you're not doing developers a good justice because they don't
Mhm.
understand or they are not always thinking about all of these edge cases. And I think we kind of grew accustomed to if I see it on Etherscan, it's a done deal. And we don't think about things like block reorgs. So I really love talking and thinking about finality, and I know you love this topic too, Ellie, because
Yes.
finality because finality is where we know for sure that the state doesn't change. Like the point of blockchain data being public is that anyone can validate this data, and that's amazing. But if anyone can validate this data, it needs to be that everyone has a consistent view of this data. And we also need to know that this data doesn't change in the future. So finality is actually very, very core to the applications we build. And it definitely applies here in bridging. Like as we just spoke about from L1 to L2 and L2 to L1, the speeds are different. And it's because of this finality, is because of this ability to verify and ensure that the data does not change. And when I look at documentation for like layer zero, for example, which we will talk about a bit lower, they do mention the fact that you have to set block confirmations for the security model that you choose as a developer, but they don't really go into the implications of block confirmations and penalty. And this is one thing that I think Espresso has really exposed me to, which really helped me to understand some of the nuances in the trust assumptions that we make. So, do you have anything in that topic that you want to share on like confirmations, finality, trust
Yeah.
assumption?
So I think the tricky thing with finality is that there's, this theoretical finality that you always should have, and then there's practical finality. So in theory, we should always wait for Ethereum finality, which is 15 minutes. Like you should never assume your transaction is done until it's finalized on Ethereum.
Yeah.
But if you wait like 3 block confirmations on Ethereum, 99.9% of the time, like, it will become final. And sometimes I do think that there's tension between we have these theoretical conversations where we talk about finality, but to be really honest, users don't actually care about Ethereum finality, and, like, they don't wait for Ethereum finality. And I think that that should be a bigger part of the conversation. Um, and maybe also in the way that we design bridges. So you can have
Mm,
native bridges, which absolutely do wait for finality and they can mint native tokens. But then you could have a non-native bridge and maybe they can mint wrapped tokens, like we talked about earlier, and they do it quicker, but they take on some really small risk that Ethereum could reorg or the L2 could reorg. Um, I also think the other thing is that L2s, it's really hard to say what is the risk of a reorg? So on Ethereum, after we get a couple blocks in, you can say that the reorg risk is very, very low.
Mhm.
Um, it's kind of hard to say if it's the same thing on L2s. Like, as far as I know, Arbitrum and OP Mainnet have never had some like huge reorg due to their fraud proofs. But I mean, it could happen. And if it's like a black swan event, it's always really hard to consider the risk of these things that are catastrophic but have such a low chance of happening. And I guess the summary of this ramble is just that we can't expect users to really do this. Like you and me are sophisticated users, and like I don't do this. I never wait for Ethereum finality like ever. So we need a better way to communicate like the trust of these bridges, and in some way that's a lot clearer than they are today.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if the bridges section of L2Beats would help with this. I need to look at it a bit more closely, but definitely like measuring and scoping out the trust assumptions. And as you said, a user does not care. A user doesn't care about many things. They just want to get their money however they get it.
Yeah.
But it's our responsibility as developers to build secure solutions because we are transacting value. And that is a very tricky industry to be in. Like the fintech industry has a
Mhm.
lot of regulation and it goes all the way down to developers as well, like the way that they implement code too. So I do think the finality topic is definitely something that should be a lot clearer. Like I would love to hear from these chains why they don't speak about it. Could it be because it is an edge case scenario and it doesn't happen that often? So they don't want to scare people away? Is it that they already have solutions for it, but they just aren't as verbose about it? So therefore it's not much of a problem. It could be that. And if that's the case, then great. But I think definitely when developers are actually building these cross-chain applications from scratch and they depend on these off-chain validator networks, and these validator networks are looking at the block confirmations and they're transacting between different blockchains, then they will need to have a really good understanding of that too. So yeah, maybe it's a space that's evolving.
Mhm.
I think I want to talk a little bit about the layer zero.
Yeah.
So layer zero is doing really well in terms of the partnerships they have and the way it's being adopted. It's being used by live blockchains and live bridges as well. And in the last episode, Ellie and I were bridging with various bridges, and we found them to be quite quick, and some of them were using layer zero. And what I find interesting about their stack, which is not different to other stacks, is the fact that you have this off-chain element. And in their case, they call it the security stack. And this is this distributed set of validators that are there to verify the transaction. So whenever you bridge, you lock the asset or you assign the asset to some contract on the source chain. And there is this off-chain network that's responsible for checking, like, hey, did the user actually just do this? And this validator set will also wait for things like a certain number of block confirmations, which by the way, the developer chooses. And once it sees that, like, hey, we have enough block confirmations as per the configuration, and we also have the ability to transfer these assets to the destination chain. So there is this off-chain infrastructure that users don't have preview into, but it's definitely very key into the way this works. And there normally would also be some sort of a relayer that's responsible for reading these messages. So, for example, once the security stack has validated that the transaction actually did occur on the source chain, there will be some attestation of some sort. The relayer will see this and then potentially send this proof to the destination chain, which is then able to allow the transaction to then be transferred or minted to the user's wallet. So this type of architecture exists across many systems. Wormhole as well, they have a validator network. We would even see soon enough that, what do you call it? I think it's called Circle Cross Chain Protocol or something like that. Like,
Oh, yeah. I
yeah,
think
what?
it's chain links something
Yeah,
something protocol.
yeah.
CCI.
Everyone has like a CT protocol, a cross chain, cross transfer, something like that. Like, yeah, that tends to be the model. There's always a verification step, and where this verification step lives is what differentiates them. But a lot of them do have this, external verification structure. And this is an example of where developers have to think about block confirmations, because if you tell the security stack, like, hey, after one block confirmation, after zero block, well, it has to be one. So after one block confirmation, like I'm willing to then verify these transactions and, create the representation on a destination chain, then boom, you have a great user experience because it happens very quickly. However, your security model some might argue might be weaker than others because if is a reorg and the transaction is not final, then you might have a bad situation there.
Yeah, so I have a question for you.
Mhm.
So a lot of like layer 0 has configurable security, which I think is a really cool feature. And other bridges have this too, like Hyperlane. They also have this. You can configure like how much security you want.
Yeah.
Is this a good thing or a bad thing? So half of my mind is that you should always allow maximum freedom for developers. But then the other part of me is like, well, maybe though we should have like defaults. I mean, these protocols do actually have defaults that are like very safe, to kind of say like, okay, if you're going to change this, you need to be really sure what you're doing if you're going to change these safety parameters. Um, yeah, just my thoughts. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, as long as you guys are telling me what the hell a block confirmation is and what finality means and how reorgs impacted,
Mhm.
like, sure, give me all the rain. But I think that if you're not equipping the developers with this kind of information, we can't just assume that they understand it. And it could be that companies like Layer Zero, when they are interacting with bridge protocols, they have like group chats and they have a very close relationship. So they are talking about these issues. But maybe for someone like me, who might just be someone hacking somewhere in Amsterdam for a weekend hackathon, like I just don't have access to this information. In terms of the decision of the stack, making it configurable, I like it because if we think about just layer twos and layer threes, that's essentially what they have allowed. They have said, okay, we have an infrastructure that allows you to create your own app chain and you can decide what your parameters are. For example, you can say zero gas fees or low gas fees or whatever you're optimizing for. And I think that is what Layer Zero is doing. And it also makes a lot of sense too, because it's a cross-chain messaging platform. So they're not even telling you what to build. Like you don't even have to bridge assets. You can just be bridging messages. So if you're bridging
Mhm.
messages, then something like block confirmations and security and reorgs maybe may not be that, how do I say? Like it might be much of an issue if, something doesn't get delivered. Um, because yeah, that happens sometime in real world messaging as well.
Mhm.
So I do like the configurability, but from the time you're telling me you're bridging tokens with value, like if I told
Yeah.
you my nephew drew this picture and I put it in an NFT and now I can't get access to it, no, 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 we have a problem.
Mhm. All right. So maybe now we can kind of revisit our question at the beginning. Is bridging even real to begin with? My opinion is that it's only real if you're actually burning the assets on the source chain. I don't think that that's necessary for all use cases, but that's my opinion. Um, and I would continue to say that, bridging is only as good as the bridge infrastructure and the chain infrastructure underlying it. Because if something goes wrong there, your asset is like not worth what it's supposed to be anymore. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Alicia.
Yes. Okay. So my last answer was B, which is assets issued on the destination chain. But you have now convinced me that there can't be two versions of the asset, even if it's locked. So I do love the idea of the asset being burned on the source chain as well, which wasn't an option. So yes, I still think B and the asset being burned on the source chain. The bridge infrastructure as well is a factor for sure. But I guess I just have this pie in the sky vision that it shouldn't really matter. What should matter is the asset. Because if I'm thinking about real world and I have to send money from one bank to the other, I don't care if you wanted me to use Zelle, Deutsche Bank. Like once you get the asset, I'm happy. So yeah, that would be my answer.
Yeah, I like that. All right. Any final thoughts on bridging? So for myself, I think that we both work at Espresso, so we're really excited about synchronous composability.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited to see how synchronous composability can change the bridging experience for users, remove the need to bridge at all, and
Yeah.
then yeah, just enable a lot of new use cases, kind of change the fee model around bridging, etc. That's what I'm most excited for. What about you?
Hmm. I'm trying not to take your answer. I will give a preamble into my thought process. I will tell everybody I love Aave and I love like once I discovered Aave, I was like, oh my gosh, I am my own bank. I can deposit ETH and I can earn interest. Not like what the bank does, where you deposit assets and you have no idea that they're letting it out. Like it's very transparent here. Maybe
Yeah.
they tell you now, but yeah. So I love that, and that's an example of composability. And that's same chain composability, right? Like let's say I bridge USDC for, not bridge, sorry, but let's say I deposit USDC onto Aave. USDC is an application that is now composable with Aave. And because it's a standard, which is ERC20, it made it very easy for the developers of Aave to build this infrastructure. So everyone who has access to USDC can do this on Aave. Now, let's say there wasn't a way to bridge native USDC to another chain, and I can't do this on Aave on another chain, and that's quite disappointing. And maybe as a user using these applications, you might not have realized that you're not getting the real USDC until you complete the bridge. So for me, I am really, really excited about having bridge transactions that are fast, of course, but also that utilize a native asset. And I think once you have that, it will be a lot easier to build synchronous composable experiences, as you are referring to, or even asynchronous composable experiences, if we have a proliferation of native asset bridging. That is also fast because we do have it with canonical bridges. Like we saw in the last episode, the Arbitrum bridge is actually quite popular, which is a canonical bridge, but it's not the fastest because of how things are being verified. So yeah, for me, I'm really excited about native cross-chain asset transfer.
Yeah, me as well. All right. So this has been Is Bridging Real? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think bridging is real? Do you think that you need to burn an asset on the source chain to make it real? Let us know. Hey, this is Ellie and Alysia. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Composable. We love hearing from you, so please hit us up on Twitter at ComposablePod, send us feedback, and join the conversation.
Our episodes go live every 2 weeks at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, so make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss an update, and you can even enjoy it with your morning coffee. Share it with your friends and fellow builders.
We'll see you next time on Composable.